This audiobook is brought to you by the Paladin Learn History app. You smell the city long before you actually see the timber frames or the stone walls. Standing on the dirt road at dawn, perhaps half a mile out, the wind shifts and hits you all at once with a thick wave of wood smoke and animal dung. There is a sharp chemical sting from the tannery pits nearby, but underneath the grime, you catch the unmistakable scent of fresh bread because someone is already firing up the ovens. The church bell rings once across the damp fields, sounding low and heavy, and you find yourself walking toward that sound. This is the medieval town as it really was, not the pristine cathedral you see in a gallery painting or the clean stone streets of a movie set. The real thing was loud, layered, and alive in a way that is incredibly hard to picture from the outside, so I want to take you inside. If you stick around until the end, we will compare these same historic locations to how they look in the modern world. When most people hear the phrase medieval city, they immediately picture the massive scale of London or Paris. They imagine a dense tangle of streets huddled around a cathedral the size of a cliff face, with thousands of people and a castle looming on a distant hill. While those famous places certainly existed, they were not typical of the era, and they don't represent the average experience of the time. The vast majority of what people in the Middle Ages called cities actually held somewhere between 2 and 10,000 residents. To put that in perspective, these places were smaller than most modern suburbs, and many had fewer people than a mid-sized university campus today. What made them cities in the eyes of the law was not their physical size, but rather their specific legal status. The word itself comes from the Latin civitas, and in medieval usage, it meant a very specific thing, a place that served as a bishop's seat. Population was always a secondary concern, which meant a town of 3,000 people with a bishop was officially a city, while a bustling trade hub of 15,000 without one was technically just a town. The church defined the category of the settlement, and the head count of the people living there didn't change that fact. But here is where it gets more interesting, because below the grand cathedral cities, there was a whole spectrum of settlements that functioned like urban centres without ever getting the official label. Market towns were the most common of these, and they relied on a royal or lordly charter that granted them the legal right to hold a weekly market. Without that piece of paper, you simply could not run a market at all, making it the single most important asset a settlement could acquire if it wanted to grow. Below the market towns, you had fortified burghs, which were walled or palisaded settlements built for defence first and commerce second. Some of these were founded by lords who wanted a secure base of operations, while others grew up naturally around a castle or a monastery because people tended to follow protection and food. Then there were the river-crossing settlements, which were rarely planned by anyone at all, but instead grew from a simple ford or a bridge. These spots became natural stopping points where tolls were collected and traders set up shop, and 20 years later you had a full neighbourhood with a name. These legal distinctions mattered because the rights of a place shaped every single detail of how it functioned on a daily basis. A market town had the power to collect tolls, hold its own courts, and regulate trades in ways a standard village never could. A chartered burgh carried defensive obligations that came with the right to tax its residents, while a cathedral city sat under the authority of a bishop who ran a parallel legal system. The hierarchy was not just a social idea, but was written directly into the charters, and those charters were eventually written into the very layout of the streets. What I find impressive is that these different types of settlements all shared the same basic logic when it came to their layout. Whether you were in a massive cathedral city like late medieval Bruges or a small wool market town in the English Midlands, the organising principles remained the same. The wall or the boundary always came first, followed by the market and the church, with housing then arranged around those three pillars. This video is going to walk you through all of it, from the small towns to the massive trade hubs. Because the principles were shared, understanding how a small English market town worked in 1320 tells you almost everything you need to know about Cologne or Montpellier at that same moment. The specific details might differ, but the bones of the city are identical, and those bones always started with the geography of the land. First, we have to talk about the water. If you look at almost any medieval town that managed to survive long enough to actually matter, you'll find it sitting right next to a river. This wasn't just about having something to drink, because in the Middle Ages, rivers did absolutely everything for a community. They functioned as the main highways for carrying goods in and the primary sewers for carrying waste out, all while powering the heavy mill wheels that ground the grain to feed the local population. During Lent, when meat was off the menu, those same waters provided the fish that kept people from starving. If you were a builder looking to create something that would last for centuries, you looked for a spot where the water was reliable. But rivers also created a very specific kind of financial opportunity at the crossings. Whether it was a shallow ford where you could wade across or a sturdy bridge, these spots became natural bottlenecks for travel. Anyone moving goods overland was forced to pass through these points, and the person who controlled that crossing held the power to charge for the privilege. While toll collection might sound unglamorous to us now, it was actually the primary seed of urban life across medieval Europe. Oxford sits exactly where it does because of a convenient ford, and Cambridge literally takes its name from the bridge over the River Cam. Hundreds of smaller English towns still end in ford or bridge for this exact reason, and you see the same pattern repeating across the landscapes of France, Germany, and the Low Countries. In almost every case, the crossing came first, and then the town grew around the money that the traffic generated. The geography of the land played another role in how these places were built. Whenever the terrain offered a defensible rise above a river valley, you almost always ended up with a split settlement consisting of an upper town on the hill and a lower town at the water's edge. The upper town was the domain of the powerful, where the castle or the bishop's residence sat at the highest point to look out over the world below. Beneath those walls, the wealthy merchant families built their homes on the sloping ground. Down at the river, where the soil was constantly wet and the flood risk was a daily reality, that's where the poor were forced to settle. The tanneries, the dye works, and the slaughterhouses all crowded the banks because they needed constant water access, and none of those foul-smelling trades were welcome near the houses of people with money. This geography didn't just shape the view from the windows, it hardwired a strict social hierarchy into the physical layout of every street. Then we have to consider the Roman question. Across a massive portion of medieval Europe, the bones of a much older civilization were already buried in the ground. The Romans had spent centuries building roads, walls, and drainage systems across Britain, Gaul, and the Rhineland, and those massive structures didn't just vanish when the empire fell apart. Even as they decayed or were stripped for parts, the lines they drew on the landscape persisted for generations. Medieval London was tucked neatly inside the old Roman walls of Londinium, and York was built directly over the remains of the legionary fortress known as Iberacum. From Cologne to Bath, the list of cities built on ancient foundations is long because medieval builders were practical people who saw the value in what was already there. Inheriting a road grid or a defensible perimeter saved an incredible amount of labor, so they simply moved in and started over. The church pulled people toward these centers in a completely different way. A bishop's seat or a major monastery functioned as a massive economic engine rather than just a place for prayer. Pilgrims arriving by the thousands needed beds, food, and local guides to show them the sights. Craftsmen found steady work repairing the great stone cathedrals, and merchants naturally followed the heavy foot traffic to set up shop. By the 12th century, the monastery at Bury St Edmunds had grown so famous for the shrine of the martyred King Edmund that it supported a full market town right outside its gates. The monks didn't necessarily plan to build a city, but they attracted so many people that a town eventually appeared out of thin air. We see the same thing happening at Canterbury or Santiago de Compostela, where a single holy relic drew the faithful, and the faithful always brought their purses with them. Finally, the market charter was the legal glue that tied all these elements together. A settlement could have the perfect river crossing, high ground for defense, and a Roman road at its doorstep, but it still wouldn't become a true town without the legal right to hold a market. This right had to be granted by a lord or a king, usually in exchange for a cut of the taxes and rents. With that charter came the official machinery that made real trade possible, including standardized weights and measures and the right to hold local courts. Without that piece of parchment, you just had a large village, but with it, you had the beginning of a true urban power. Once a settlement secured its charter and its location, the very next thing the people built was a boundary. Most people today get the history of the wall wrong because they assume it was strictly a military structure meant for war. While it certainly helped during a siege, the wall did something much more constant in the daily life of a medieval town. It defined exactly who was inside the law and who was left out in the cold. To live within those walls meant you were a subject of the town's courts, entitled to its protections and liable for its taxes. Your property had legal standing there, and your membership in a trade guild actually meant something. The moment you stepped back outside that boundary, most of those rights simply vanished. The wall wasn't just a pile of stone and mortar, it was a legal line drawn in the dirt that dictated how every person functioned. The gates were the specific points where that legal line became a physical reality. Every traveller, every merchant cart, and every herd of livestock entering the town had to pass through a gate where guards were always stationed. Goods were poked and prodded for inspection, and tolls were collected on everything from grain and cloth to wine and cattle. Strangers were questioned about their business, and anyone who looked like they might cause trouble could be turned away on the spot. During times of plague or political unrest, the heavy doors were slammed shut and nobody was allowed to pass at all. The gate functioned as a checkpoint and a customs post, serving as the town's primary way to collect revenue before a visitor even reached the market square. Now, there is a detail here that most historical paintings get completely wrong. The majority of medieval towns did not actually have stone walls. Building a stone curtain wall like the ones you see today at Carcassonne was brutally expensive, and only the wealthiest or most strategic cities could ever afford that kind of masonry. Most smaller market towns had to make do with earthen banks topped by wooden fences, or perhaps just a deep ditch and a thick hedgerow to make entry difficult. Some places had nothing more than a simple trench and a general understanding that you were supposed to use the gates anyway. The heavy burden of maintaining these defences fell on the townspeople themselves rather than the lord, and the old borough records are still full of people complaining about the cost. The moment you stepped inside the gate, the commercial logic of the medieval world hit you in the face. The space right next to the entrance was almost never used for houses because it was too valuable for business. This is where the inns were located, since travellers needed beds and horses needed stables the second they arrived. Money changers set up their tables nearby because merchants coming from distant regions carried foreign coins that had to be converted before any trading could happen. Food sellers worked the same hustle, positioning themselves exactly where a hungry traveller would be most likely to drop their coins after days on the road. It was a calculated system designed to capture wealth the very moment it entered the city limits. But if you stepped back outside the gate, the entire picture reversed into something much grittier. The space just beyond the wall was known as the suburb, a word that literally means under the city, and it was where the town pushed everything it needed but didn't want to look at. Tanneries were relegated to these outskirts because the process of curing leather used such massive amounts of urine and dung that the air became genuinely toxic. Slaughterhouses were sent there too, along with the blood and the rotting offal that they produced every day. Even the leper hospitals were placed just far enough from the gate to make the healthy feel safe, yet close enough that the sick could still beg for charity. The suburb wasn't a neighbourhood in any way we would recognise today. It was simply the place where the town dumped its necessary ugliness and tried to look the other way. The wall sent a very clear message to everyone who approached it. It told you exactly where the town began and where the civilized world ended. Everything beyond that stone or timber line was something else entirely. If you've enjoyed this look at the hidden logic of the medieval city, I'd love to keep building this journey into the past with you. Let me know in the comments which city you'd like to see brought back to life next. Thank you for watching. Once you pass through the heavy timber of the town gate, the street begins to tighten before suddenly opening up into a wide, paved expanse. This shift in the landscape wasn't some accident of medieval geometry, but rather a deliberate piece of urban planning designed to funnel every soul in the district toward a single point. The market square was the very reason the town existed in the first place, acting as the engine that pulled in travellers and kept the local economy breathing. On a typical Tuesday or Wednesday, you might find the square strangely quiet, with only a few stray dogs or a lone cart crossing the stones. But when market day arrived, usually once or twice a week, depending on the town's royal charter, the entire space transformed into a chaotic, living organism. Stalls were hammered together long before the sun came up, and farmers walked their livestock in from the muddy tracks of the surrounding countryside until the side streets were completely choked with carts. By the time the church bell rang for the morning office of Prime, the air was already thick with the smell of wood smoke, wet wool, and the sharp tang of freshly slaughtered meat. This was the functional heart of the town, and while the cathedral or the castle might have looked more impressive, the market was where the real power resided. The way people set up their trades inside this space followed a strict, regulated logic that was enforced by the town wardens. Butchers occupied their own specific row, which in many English towns was known as the shambles, a name taken from the sturdy wooden benches they used to display their cuts. Cloth merchants took over another section to keep their expensive fabrics away from the mess, while fishmongers stayed as close to the water supply as possible so they could wash down their stalls at the end of the day. Grain sellers, potters, and candle makers all had their assigned territories, and if you tried to set up in the wrong spot, you'd be facing a heavy fine before the noon bell even rang. The wardens didn't just watch the locations, as they also spent their day checking weights and measures to ensure no one was being cheated. Fraud was a constant threat, and the punishment for getting caught was both swift and very public. A baker who sold light loaves might be dragged through the dirt with the bread tied around his neck, while a merchant using false weights could watch his entire inventory go up in flames in the center of the square. Standing at the center of all this commerce was usually a market cross, a tall stone pillar that served as a reminder that even business was conducted under the watchful eye of the divine. In larger settlements, this might be replaced by a market hall, a massive timber-framed building where the town kept its official scales and where the most expensive goods, like fine wool and silk, could be traded away from the rain. These halls functioned as the town's brain, serving as the place where disputes were settled, royal announcements were read aloud, and local bylaws were debated. In an age before newspapers or public notices, if you wanted to know what was happening in the world, you went to the market hall. While the weekly market fed the local families, the annual fairs were something else entirely, collapsing the distances of the medieval world into a single event. The regular market served people within a 10-mile radius, but the great fairs at places like Stourbridge or Winchester brought in merchants from Flanders, the Baltic ports, and even the distant cities of Italy. They brought more than just exotic spices and fine furs, as they also introduced sophisticated financial tools like letters of credit and bills of exchange. These documents allowed an English wool grower to do business with an Italian banking house through a chain of trade that spanned half of Europe. If the weekly market was about survival, the annual fair was about connection, plugging a small town into a global network of wealth and ambition. The Guildhall usually sat right on the edge of the square, and this positioning was a physical statement of who really ran the show. Both merchant and craft guilds understood that being close to the market meant being close to the money, and the men who controlled the square controlled the standards and the prices for everyone else. Many of these guild masters also sat on the town council, allowing them to write the very regulations that protected their own members while squeezing out any competition from the outside. It's a reminder that even as the town grew, its limits were defined by the men who owned the ground beneath the stalls. If the market provided the town with its food and its finery, it was the church that provided it with its pulse. In a world where nobody carried a watch and clocks were a rare luxury for the ultra-wealthy, the church bell was the only shared timepiece that every person in the settlement relied on. It rang at prime to start the working day, then again at terce and sext as the sun climbed toward noon, and finally at vespers when the sun dipped below the horizon. These bells didn't just call the monks to prayer, as they actually organized the labor of every blacksmith, tanner, and baker in the district. When you heard that iron tongue strike the bell, you knew exactly where you stood in the day, and without that sound, the entire rhythm of urban life would have fallen into total confusion. It is easy to imagine every medieval town having a massive cathedral, but the reality was much more modest for the average person. A cathedral required a bishop and a massive diocese to support it, which meant most people spent their entire lives under the shadow of a simple parish church. This single stone building, with its lone priest and crowded churchyard, served the same social purpose as the great cathedrals, but on a much more intimate scale. In many of these smaller towns, the parish church was the only stone structure for miles in any direction, making it a landmark that could be seen from the furthest fields. Think about the physical impact that building had on a regular person who spent their life in cramped timber-framed rooms with low ceilings and thatched roofs. Walking into a church in the year 1300 was a sensory experience that hit you in the body long before it reached your soul. The ceiling was higher than anything you had ever stood under, and the light filtered through coloured glass in a way that felt almost supernatural. The air always smelled of beeswax and expensive incense layered over the cold, damp scent of ancient stone. The building itself was making a silent argument about the permanence of power, and it made that point every single day just by towering over the wooden houses of the poor. The churchyard surrounding the building was rarely the quiet, sombre place we imagine today, as it functioned as one of the busiest public spaces in the town. While the dead were buried there in layers, with older bones occasionally moved to charnel houses to make room for the new, the living used the grass for almost everything. When the market square got too crowded, the stalls would spill over against the churchyard walls, and children used the headstones as markers for their games. You might even see a theatrical troupe performing a mystery play right next to the graves, as it was the only open space large enough to hold a crowd. The line between the sacred and the everyday was incredibly thin, and the church authorities generally allowed it because that was simply where the people were. In the larger cathedral cities, this energy was amplified by the massive business of pilgrimage, which functioned as a medieval version of the tourist industry. Cities that held famous relics, like the bones of Thomas Becket in Canterbury or the shrine of St. James, attracted thousands of travellers who all needed a place to sleep and a hot meal. This created a secondary economy of hostels, licensed guides, and shops selling leaden badges or small bottles of holy water to take back home. On the surface, it was all about devotion and the hope of a miracle, but underneath, it was a sophisticated machine designed to move money from the pockets of pilgrims into the coffers of the church. For the people living in a smaller parish, the local priest was often the only person for miles who knew how to read and write. This made him much more than just a religious leader, as he was the one who recorded every birth, wrote out the wills for dying labourers, and read royal decrees to the illiterate crowds. He acted as a mediator for neighbours who were fighting over property lines, helping them settle things quietly before they had to pay the expensive fees of a formal court. He was the town's scribe, its record keeper, and its moral compass all at once, usually doing the work for a small stipend that barely kept him fed. The church didn't just organize the way people died, as it shaped the way they lived, worked, and understood their place in a world that was often harsh and unpredictable. If the market square was the heart of the town's economy, the guild was the set of lungs keeping the whole thing breathing. Every trade that mattered in a medieval town belonged to a guild, from the bakers and butchers to the tanners, weavers, and goldsmiths. But these weren't just simple clubs for craftsmen. A guild controlled who could enter the shop, how many years they had to train, what they could charge for a pair of boots, and exactly what happened to a man if his work didn't meet the group's standards. It was a legal operating system for the entire economy, and it definitely had teeth. Inside every guild, the hierarchy ran 3 levels deep to keep order. At the very top sat the master craftsman, a man who owned his own workshop and had proven his skills to the satisfaction of the other masters. To reach this rank, he usually had to produce a specific piece of work that the senior members judged as perfect. This was the original masterwork, and passing that test was the only way to gain full membership and start hiring others. Below the masters were the journeymen, who were qualified builders or weavers who had finished their training but hadn't yet saved enough to open their own storefronts. They worked for daily wages and moved from shop to shop, slowly building up their reputation and their coin. At the very bottom of the ladder were the apprentices. These were boys, often as young as 10 or 14, sent by their families to live in a master's house under a strict 7-year contract. During that time, the master provided food, a bed, and the secrets of the trade, while the boy spent his days sweeping floors and running errands until he finally learned the craft. The apprenticeship contract was a serious legal bond that the guild enforced in both directions. If a master was caught abusing a boy, he could be hauled before the guild court and punished, but an apprentice who tried to run away would be hunted down, returned, and heavily fined. 7 years of service wasn't just a suggestion, it was a debt that had to be paid in full. Quality control was the most visible part of a guild's daily power. A warden could walk into any workshop at any time, look at the goods sitting on the bench and seize anything that looked sloppy or cheap. Sometimes these rejected items were burned or smashed in the middle of the street for everyone to see. The man who made them faced a heavy fine, and if he kept doing it, he might be forced to carry his defective work through the market as a sign of his shame. It sounds incredibly harsh, but it worked because the guild's reputation was the only thing keeping the customers coming back. What we don't always hear about is how the guild stepped in when life fell apart. In a world where illness or a sudden injury could end a career, the guild acted as a massive insurance policy for its members. If a craftsman fell sick, the common fund paid for his care, and if he died, the guild ensured he received a proper burial instead of a pauper's grave. In many towns, the widow of a master could even keep the workshop running under her late husband's name for a while. You paid your annual dues because you knew that if the worst happened, the guild looked after its own. A woman's place in these structures was often complicated and changed depending on which century or town you were in. While formal membership was usually closed to them, many women operated under a legal status called femme sole, which gave them the right to trade independently. In cities like London or Paris, women actually dominated certain trades like silkworking, even if the official records tried to ignore them. The fact that they don't show up in the guild books often tells us more about the men writing the books than the people actually doing the work. There was always a simmering tension between the guilds and the town councils that governed the streets. The guilds wanted a total monopoly so they could shut out any outside competition and keep their prices high. On the other side, the town councils wanted open markets and lower prices to keep the residents happy and the tax revenue flowing. You can still read the arguments in the old court rolls from Bristol or Bruges, where these two groups fought for power decade after decade without ever truly finding a middle ground. Below the wealthy masters and the merchants who sat on the council was the group that actually kept the town moving every single day. These were the unskilled poor, the water carriers, dung collectors, street cleaners, and day labourers who did the heavy lifting. They were the largest group of people in any medieval city, yet they left almost no trace in history because the people writing the records didn't think their lives were worth a single drop of ink. We have to piece their world together from old wage lists and court complaints about vagrants wandering the streets. What we find is a life built entirely on being physically close to the work. If you didn't have a trade or a guild to protect you, you sold your strength and your sweat every morning to the highest bidder. Workers gathered at the market square or the docks before the sun came up, waiting for a foreman to point a finger at them. If you got picked, you ate that night. If you didn't, you went hungry. There were no weekly salaries or sick days in this world, and the work could vanish the moment the employer changed his mind. The housing for these labourers was just as fragile as their income. The poorest families usually ended up in one of three places: the cramped upper floors of tenements, the dusty lofts above noisy workshops, or the shacks built directly against the inside of the town walls. Those lean-tos against the stone walls appear in the records all the time because the wall provided one side of the house for free. It was solid, it was out of the way, and nobody with any money wanted to live that close to the edge of town anyway. The poor simply moved into whatever gaps the wealthy left behind. Contrary to what many people think, the urban poor were actually much more mobile than the rich guild members. While a master was tied to his shop, a labourer followed the work wherever it went. They moved to towns where a new cathedral was being built or a bridge was being repaired, and they often left the city entirely during the late summer to help with the harvest. A town's population would swell and shrink with the seasons, and the people moving in and out were always the ones at the very bottom of the social ladder. Then there were the people who were outsiders by law, not just by their bank accounts. Jewish communities lived in many European towns during the 11th and 12th centuries, often clustered into specific neighborhoods. As time went on, they were forced into these areas by law and made to pay special taxes that their Christian neighbors never saw. Because they were barred from the guilds and most trades, many turned to moneylending, a role that made them essential to the economy, but also deeply hated by those who owed them money. This pattern of resentment played out across England, France, and Germany for centuries. The authorities tolerated these communities as long as the loans were needed, but they were often expelled the moment the debts became too high or the political mood turned sour. England kicked out its entire Jewish population in 1290, and France did the same in 1306. Families that had lived in those streets for generations were suddenly gone, and while the towns usually went broke shortly after, the leaders who made those choices rarely admitted they had made a mistake. Foreign merchants lived as a different kind of outsider, operating under special charters that gave them the right to trade but very little else. Whether they were Flemish cloth dealers or Hanseatic traders from the Baltic, they usually couldn't own land or marry into local families without special permission. They lived in their own designated halls and hostels, keeping to themselves partly by choice and partly because they had to. They were taxed at much higher rates than the locals, which served as a constant reminder that they were only guests as long as they remained useful. In the end, the only places that offered any real help to the truly desperate were the almshouses and hospitals run by the church. These institutions were almost always overcrowded and short on cash, struggling to keep up with the sheer number of people who had nowhere else to turn. It's a reminder that even as these medieval cities grew into massive centers of power, the limits of their charity were felt by everyone living in the shadows of the great stone walls. If you step out of the almshouse doorway and onto the street, the first thing you notice is that there is absolutely no separation between the road and the life happening on it. Medieval towns were dense by design rather than neglect, because every square foot inside a defensive wall was incredibly expensive to maintain. Buildings were crowded so close together that the upper floors actually jettied out over the lane to save space, and sometimes the gap between roofs was narrow enough for neighbors to reach out and nearly touch hands. Down on the ground, the street felt like a permanent shadow even on a sunny day, creating a dark canyon of timber and plaster that caught every bit of waste the town produced. What the street collected was a specific heavy mixture of animal dung from the horses and pigs moving through the lanes and kitchen scraps tossed from upper windows. You would see the bloody runoff from the butcher stalls mixing with tanning liquor, which was a black, acrid liquid made from soaking hides in oak bark. Human waste from household chamber pots was emptied directly into open drainage ditches that ran right down the centre of the road. While almost every medieval town from London to Paris had strict bylaws against this, the reality was that enforcement rarely kept up with the sheer volume of the mess. When the weather turned wet, all of these different elements merged into a single, thick substance that made walking a genuine challenge. Unpaved streets transformed into deep mud that swallowed everything, and heavy carts with iron-rimmed wheels cut deep ruts that quickly filled with standing water. To deal with this, pedestrians wore wooden platform shoes called pattens to keep their actual leather shoes elevated above the filth. If the rain fell hard enough, the central ditches would overflow and send everything washing downhill toward the river, which was often the same place the town drew its drinking water. The smell of a medieval city wasn't just one scent, but a heavy layer of odors that shifted depending on which way the wind was blowing. If you were near the tannery district, you felt the full weight of the curing process, where urine and dung were used in soak pits to soften leather over several weeks. being downwind of a tannery on a warm afternoon was likely one of the most punishing sensory experiences a human could endure in the Middle Ages. However, if you moved toward the bakery district, the air changed to the scent of wood smoke and warm grain, while the fish stalls offered a sharp mix of salt and river rot. The sounds of the town were just as specific and rhythmic as the smells, dominated by the constant clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoing through the narrow streets. You would hear the low groan of mill wheels turning in the stream and the loud shouts of barrow men calling out their prices to the crowd. Pigs squealed near the slaughterhouses while church bells rang out overhead to mark the passing hours of the workday. Even at night, when the gates were shut and the markets closed, the town stayed alive with the sound of barking dogs and the creak of heavy timber frames settling in the cold. By the 13th and 14th centuries, larger towns began the expensive process of paving their main thoroughfares with stone cobbles to improve drainage and movement. These paved sections stayed much drier and allowed carts to pass without getting bogged down in the silt, but the progress was always uneven. The main market approaches were usually finished first, while the smaller side streets were often left as dirt and mud for centuries. If you look at the street names that survived into the modern era, you get a very honest map of what these places actually were. Names like Butcher Row, Tanner's Lane, and Fish Street tell you exactly what kind of work was happening on those corners. There was even a Gropecunt Lane in several English towns, which served as a blunt reminder of where the red light district was located. The medieval street simply named itself after the activity it hosted, leaving no gap between the name of the place and the reality of the life lived there. It is a surprising physical fact that most people living in a medieval town didn't actually have a kitchen in their homes. If you lived in a single-room tenement or a subdivided floor shared with other families, there simply wasn't enough space for a hearth that was safe for a fire. Because the risk of burning down a dense wooden building was so high, indoor cooking was often restricted or physically impossible for the poor. This meant that the urban population had to eat out every single day, making street vendors and cook shops a vital piece of city infrastructure rather than a luxury. A cook shop was usually a simple ground floor room with a large fire where a cook sold hot, prepared meals to people who couldn't cook for themselves. For a few coins, you could buy a bowl of pottage, which was a thick stew made of grain, dried peas, and whatever root vegetables were cheapest that morning. You might eat it right there at the counter or carry it back to your room, perhaps picking up a meat pasty or a hot pie from a vendor with a tray around his neck. This food was cheap and reliable, providing a hot meal to laborers who had no other way to get one. Bread was the foundation of every single meal, regardless of whether you were a beggar or a lord. A typical laborer doing heavy physical work might eat nearly 2 pounds of bread in a single day to keep his energy up through 12 hours of hauling and digging. While the wealthy preferred white bread made from finely milled wheat, the poor ate dark, heavy loaves made from rye or barley. The taste was certainly different, but the darker grain actually provided more of the basic nutrition that a working body needed to survive the day. Because everyone depended on the baker to survive, he was one of the most tightly regulated people in the entire town. The assize of bread was a royal law that fixed the price and weight of a loaf based on the current cost of grain, leaving the baker with a very thin profit margin. If a baker tried to cheat the system by selling light loaves or watering down the dough, his punishment was a very public and humiliating ordeal. He would be tied to a wooden frame and dragged through the market with the bad bread tied around his neck so the entire neighborhood could see his shame. When it came to thirst, ale was the daily drink for almost everyone because the local water supply was often dangerously unreliable. The same river that provided drinking water was usually the same place where butchers and tanners dumped their waste, making raw water a gamble. Since brewing ale required boiling the water, it was measurably safer to drink a mug of ale than a cup of water taken downstream from a workshop. Women known as alewives brewed this drink in their homes and would hang a long pole called an ale stake over their door to let neighbors know a fresh batch was ready. Meat was the great divider of social classes, and you could tell a person's status just by looking at what was on their plate. A wealthy household enjoyed roasted joints of beef, game birds, and expensive fish seasoned with spices brought from thousands of miles away. In contrast, The poor survived on offal, saltfish, and the ever-present pottage made from dried peas and scraps. You would see live animals driven into the market on their own feet, only to be slaughtered on the spot, with their blood running directly into the street drains. The church calendar also played a massive role in what people ate by enforcing strict fasting days on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. During the 40 days of Lent, meat was forbidden entirely, which turned fish eating into a legal obligation rather than just a personal choice. This religious law is the reason the trade in salted herring grew to such a massive scale, as the entire population was forced by the church to find an alternative to meat for nearly half the year. If you've ever wondered why the medieval fish trade was so dominant, it's because the law literally required it. Keeping a medieval city fed was a constant struggle, but keeping the people inside it alive when they fell ill was an even greater challenge. The medical system tasked with this job was far more sophisticated than we usually give it credit for, though it remained much more limited than the doctors of the time would ever care to admit. Medieval medicine generally operated on three separate tracks that rarely crossed paths. At the very top of the hierarchy was the university-trained physician, a man who built his entire practice on Galenic theory. This was a system handed down from ancient Greece that viewed the human body as a delicate balance of four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To these doctors, every illness was simply an imbalance, and every treatment was an attempt to pull the scales back to centre. This is why bloodletting became the most common medical intervention on the planet, as physicians believed that draining a patient would reduce excess fluids and restore a healthy ratio. While this sounds like useless torture to us now, it wasn't just random superstition. It was a coherent, logical system built on centuries of observation, even if it was unfortunately trapped by a completely wrong assumption about how biology actually works. Working right alongside these theorists was the barber surgeon, a guild tradesman who stood on the same social rung as a baker or a weaver. In many ways, he was the more useful man to have around because he handled the messy, physical reality of the body. He was the one who actually picked up the lancet for bloodletting, pulled rotted teeth, cleaned out festering wounds, and set broken bones back into place. In the most desperate cases, he was the one performing amputations. When it came to treating battlefield injuries or traumatic accidents, medieval surgery was surprisingly effective for the era. During the 13th and 14th centuries, surgeons used wine to wash out open gashes, unknowingly using its antiseptic properties to save lives, and they developed packing techniques that kept infection rates much lower than you might expect. You could always spot a surgeon's shop by the red and white striped pole out front, representing the blood and the bandages of the trade, a symbol that remarkably still hangs over barbershops today. If the surgeon was the mechanic, the apothecary was the supplier who sold the necessary compounds. His shelves were packed with herbs, minerals, and exotic spices brought in from the Mediterranean, like poppy for dulling pain or willow bark to break a fever. We know now that many of these ingredients have real pharmacological power, proving that the apothecary wasn't just guessing. He was relying on a massive bank of practical knowledge that had been gathered long before anyone could explain the science behind it. This put him in the same position as almost every medical professional in history, using what worked simply because it worked. Then, everything changed when the plague arrived. The Black Death hit European shores from the east in 1347, reaching Sicily by the autumn and tearing through the continent with a speed that no one could possibly outrun. By the time the initial wave subsided in 1353, the world looked completely different. When historians look at old parish records and tax rolls today, they see names simply vanishing from the books, leading to an estimated death toll of 30 to 60% of the entire population. Urban centres were hit the hardest because the sheer density of the streets did exactly what density always does to a flea-borne pathogen. It acted like an accelerant. Some towns lost more than half of their residents in a single summer, leaving streets that were packed in 1346 standing eerily quiet a decade later. In fact, many European cities didn't see their populations return to those pre-plague levels until well into the 1500s. At the time, nobody had any idea what was actually killing them. The leading theory was miasma, the belief that disease was caused by bad air rising up from rotting organic matter. This led doctors to tell people to burn aromatic herbs or stay away from damp, low-lying areas. While they were wrong about the air itself, they were accidentally right about the geography. Those low areas near riverbanks and waste channels were the exact places where the rat populations lived, meaning the advice sometimes saved lives for the wrong reasons. The most lasting legacy of the plague was the accidental birth of the world's first public health infrastructure. In 1377, the port city of Ragusa, which we now know as Dubrovnik, began forcing all incoming ships and travellers to stay isolated before they could enter the city. This isolation lasted for 40 days, or quarantino in the local dialect, which is exactly where our modern word quarantine comes from. Other major ports saw the logic and adopted the same rules within a few decades. Public health wasn't invented by a scientist in a lab, but by city leaders who were tired of watching their neighbors die and realized they had to do something to stop the spread. It's also worth remembering that medieval hospitals weren't really places where you went to get cured. They functioned more like hospices, run almost entirely by religious orders as places where the sick could find a bed, a warm meal, and their last rites. The goal wasn't to fix the body, but to ensure a good death, where a person wasn't forced to face the end of their life alone. While disease was a constant shadow, fire was the more immediate terror, and in a town built almost entirely of wood, disaster was always just one mistake away. If you look at a typical building in a market town of a few thousand people, you'll see why they were so vulnerable. The frames were heavy timber, the walls were made of wattle and daub, and the roofs were usually thatched with dried straw or reeds. Even though wooden shingles were safer, most people chose thatch because it was cheaper and easier to find. Inside these tinder boxes, life revolved around heat. People cooked over open hearths on the ground floor, burned candles in every room after sunset, and ran workshops with forges and kilns that stayed hot for days. On any given night, the only thing standing between a peaceful evening and a total catastrophe was a single lamp getting knocked over in the dark. Once a fire caught hold of a thatched roof, the building was usually lost in minutes. The dry straw would go up instantly, throwing glowing embers into the air that landed on the next roof, and then the next, until the whole street was involved. In these narrow lanes where the upper floors leaned out so far that neighbors could almost touch hands across the gap, the flames moved much faster than any human response. The only tools people had were leather buckets passed along a human chain from the nearest well, and while that might save a shed on the edge of the fire, it did almost nothing once the center of a block was fully engulfed. When a fire started moving through a neighborhood, the only real solution was to start tearing things down. Men would rush ahead of the flames to demolish perfectly good buildings, creating a gap of empty space that the fire couldn't jump across. It was a brutal, desperate choice to destroy a neighbor's home and workshop on the hope that it might save the rest of the town. Afterward, the legal fallout was often just as messy as the fire itself. Borough records are full of claims for compensation and long-running court battles over who gave the order to pull down a house and who was going to pay for the loss. These major fires weren't rare events that happened once a century. London burned over and over again throughout the medieval period, including a massive fire in 1212 that killed hundreds and took out the buildings on the original London Bridge. Rouen suffered similar fates, as did countless smaller towns across England and France, yet people almost always rebuilt on the exact same footprint. Even when the timber was gone, the street patterns and the land records remained, so the town would simply rise again from its own ashes. Flooding followed a much more predictable, if equally destructive, rhythm. If you lived in a river town, you expected the water to rise every year. The lower town was always the most dangerous place to be, but that was where the poor lived and where the water-dependent trades like tanning or milling had to operate. Because the risk was so high, it became standard practice to build these structures on raised stone platforms or thick timber stilts. This wasn't a just-in-case measure, it was a basic requirement of life. You built high because you knew the river was coming, and you usually knew exactly when it would arrive. Over time, these constant battles with the elements forced towns to get smarter about how they were built. By the 13th and 14th centuries, new bylaws started appearing that required stone foundations and tiled roofs in the most crowded areas. When a town had to rebuild after a disaster, they often tried to improve the layout by widening the streets to act as fire breaks or regulating how far upper floors could hang over the road. They were slowly learning that the way a city was shaped could be its best defense. The deeper effect of all this was psychological, creating a world where people lived with the constant knowledge that everything could be lost in an instant. You learned to store your most valuable items in the safest spot you had, and kept your land deeds in fire-resistant boxes if you could afford them. You lived your life knowing, without anyone having to remind you, that everything you had built could vanish before the next church bell rang. If you've enjoyed this look into the grit and reality of the past, I'd love to keep building this journey with you. If there's another city or a specific moment in time you'd like to see brought back to life, let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching. To keep a medieval town from spinning into chaos, you needed a firm set of rules. Think about the constant pressure of fire risks, market fraud, and the inevitable violence that breaks out when you cram thousands of people into a walled space without enough food or money. The solution was the law, though it probably wouldn't look familiar to us today. Instead of one clear system, a town dweller lived under several different legal layers that ran at the same time, often clashing or even arguing with each other in the very same courtroom. For most people living within the walls, the borough court was the center of their legal world. Depending on which town you were walking through, you might hear it called the Guildhall Court, but its purpose was always the same. This was where the messy, daily texture of urban life was sorted out. From unpaid debts and property trespassing to a bloody fistfight outside a tavern or a merchant caught selling short-measured cloth. Cases moved with a speed that would shock a modern lawyer, often being heard and settled in a single afternoon session. The town needed commerce to keep moving, and a court that dragged its feet for months served nobody except the professional legal class, which didn't really exist yet in most smaller towns. You argued your own case, called your own witnesses, and waited for the court to decide your fate right then and there. If you were out after dark, you might run into the night watch, which was the closest thing the town had to a police force. It was also deeply and structurally unpopular with almost everyone involved. This wasn't a professional job, but rather a rotating obligation that fell on every adult male citizen to take his turn patrolling the streets once the gates were locked. You'd spend the night carrying a lantern and a heavy stick, responsible for challenging strangers and screaming for help if a fire started or a crime occurred. The duty was unpaid. It kept you out of a warm bed on freezing nights, and the records are absolutely full of men paying heavy fines just to skip their shift. While the wealthiest towns eventually hired full-time constables to handle the night shift, most places simply didn't have the coin to spare. When the court did hand down a sentence, the punishment was almost always public and physical. The stocks and the pillory weren't tucked away in a private courtyard, they stood right in the middle of the market square for everyone to see. Floggings happened in the open air, and executions were massive public events that drew crowds from miles away. This wasn't just about being cruel, though there was plenty of that to go around, but rather about communication. In a world where most people couldn't read a notice or pick up a newspaper, public punishment was how the town broadcast its rules to the people. Watching a neighbor stand in the pillory for cheating customers taught you the cost of fraud in a way that no written bylaw ever could. Running right alongside the town's authority was the church court, which handled an entirely different category of human life. They dealt with marriage disputes, the complicated details of wills and inheritance, and even defamation. If you said something damaging about a neighbor's moral character, that was a religious matter rather than a civil one. The church also oversaw sexual offences and heresy, maintaining its own prisons and its own range of fines. The ultimate weapon they held was excommunication, which was a terrifying prospect in a society built entirely around the religious community. Being excommunicated cut you off from the sacraments and burial in holy ground, effectively making you a ghost while you were still alive. Then there was the ancient rite of sanctuary, a rule that offered a strange kind of mercy to those on the run. If a fugitive could reach a church and touch the altar, the door ring, or even just cross the threshold, they were granted 40 days of total legal protection. During that time, the people chasing them couldn't enter to take them by force. This wasn't just a legend, it was a real right written into the law and used regularly by everyone from murderers to people fleeing a debt they couldn't pay. It gave a person 40 days to negotiate terms, find witnesses, or scrape together enough money for a settlement. Some people even chose permanent sanctuary, living out their lives within the church walls and surviving on food passed to them over the boundary line. Because these different legal systems overlapped so much, a clever defendant could sometimes find a way to shift their case from one court to another to find a more sympathetic judge. It's a reminder that legal maneuvering and looking for loopholes weren't invented in the modern era. They were part of the game even hundreds of years ago. While the law told you what you were allowed to do, it was the calendar that dictated exactly when you did it. A medieval year wasn't just a long string of 365 identical days, but rather a series of fixed points that gave life a predictable rhythm. Between feast days, fast days, and market days, time felt more like a repeating pattern than a straight line moving forward. The church calendar carved out roughly 50 feast days every year when ordinary work was supposed to stop completely. On these days, the workshops were locked, and the markets stayed quiet because you were religiously obligated to step away from your workbench. That's actually more time off than many people get in the modern world, though we shouldn't confuse time off with actual prosperity. A feast day gave your body a rest, but it didn't put any money in your pocket, and for a day, labourer with no savings, a string of holidays could mean a week of going hungry. The biggest feasts of the year, like Christmas, Easter, and Michaelmas in late September, served as the structural hinges for the entire economy. Michaelmas was the day when rents were due and annual contracts between masters and servants finally expired. It was the moment when travelling merchants settled their long-standing accounts and apprentices were formally released from their years of service. Because nobody had a standardized calendar hanging on their wall, these religious feasts provided the only fixed points that everyone could agree on. When a landlord said the rent was due at Michaelmas, every person for 100 miles knew exactly which day he meant without having to count a single thing. Carnival was something else entirely, falling just before the somber start of Lent. This was a period of licensed disorder where the normal rules of society were briefly set aside. People drank heavily, wore masks to hide their identities, and participated in theatrical performances where the social hierarchy was flipped upside down. Servants would openly mock their masters in the street, and powerful figures were subjected to the kind of public ridicule that would get you thrown in a dungeon any other week of the year. Some historians think this was a necessary release valve that made the other 50 weeks of bowing and scraping easier to handle. But the records show that real violence usually spiked during Carnival. It suggests that the chaos wasn't always as controlled as the people in charge hoped it would be. As the weather warmed up, the summer months pulled the town's population outward and brought the rest of the world in. Harvest workers and merchants flooded through the gates from the countryside, while pilgrims passed through on their way to distant shrines and construction projects started up again after the winter freeze. During these months, the town felt louder, more crowded, and significantly more dangerous than it did in the quiet of winter. When winter finally arrived, everything seemed to contract and pull inward. Fuel was incredibly expensive, and the poor often spent a huge portion of their tiny income just on wood and charcoal to keep from freezing. Food stores that looked plenty large back in October started to run dangerously thin by the time February rolled around. This combination of bitter cold and malnutrition lowered everyone's resistance to sickness, allowing the diseases that always lived in crowded towns to move even faster through weakened bodies. The church bells still rang out across the rooftops, but there were far fewer people walking the streets to hear them. Those bells were the heartbeat of the town, dividing the working day into segments that every person recognized by sound alone. You heard prime at dawn when the gates swung open and the bakers pulled their first loaves from the oven. Terce came in the mid-morning when the market was at its loudest, followed by a pause at sext during the noon hour. Then came none in the afternoon, and finally vespers at dusk, signalling the time to pull down the stalls and secure the gates for the night. In this world, time wasn't a resource that you tried to manage or save. It was a series of recurring moments, each with its own specific name, its own set of duties, and its own particular quality of light. Everything I've described in this video comes directly from primary sources. We aren't looking at general impressions of the medieval period, but rather specific documents like guild records, borough court rolls, and plague chronicles. These are the municipal bylaws and illustrated manuscripts that people actually handled and used during the centuries we're exploring today. The Luttrell Psalter was produced in England between 1320 and 1340, and its painted margins show agricultural labour and feasting with incredible detail. You can actually see the grain of the timber on a cartwheel in those illustrations. Another vital source is the Très riche Heure du Duc de Berry from around 1412, which gives us 12 illuminated calendar pages. These scenes show townspeople and labourers working against specific architectural backgrounds, from towering castle walls to bare winter fields. For the city layouts, I've relied on Braun and Hogenberg's Civitates Orbis Terrarum, a massive atlas of city views published starting in 1572. It collected bird's-eye maps of hundreds of European towns drawn with such precision that archaeologists still use them to locate buried structures today. Meanwhile, guild records from places like Bristol, Norwich and Bruges allow us to track membership fines and quality disputes across several generations. Borough court rolls from English towns even record the names of people who sold short-weight bread or skipped their night watch rotation. These aren't just background sources because they provide the actual texture of daily life. What the AI reconstruction adds to this material is primarily a sense of space. A manuscript illumination shows you one moment from a single angle, and a period map gives you the street pattern while flattening the scale. The reconstruction work takes those fixed sources and makes the relationships between them legible for us. It shows how the distance from a tannery to the market square matched the wind direction noted in old complaints, and it translates the upper town's elevation into the social geography described in the court rolls. Essentially, it fills in the connective tissue between sources that were never designed to talk to each other. However, it is important to remember that the technology cannot invent new facts. The colour of a painted shopfront in this reconstruction comes from pigment analysis of surviving buildings and manuscript evidence rather than creative guessing. The sounds you hear in this video come from the specific trades that court records placed on these exact streets. When I describe what a medieval town smelled like, that reconstruction rests on the documented processes of tanning and brewing as recorded in guild ordinances. Where the sources go silent, the reconstruction has to stop, and that boundary really matters. The towns I've focused on most heavily here are not famous capitals like London or Paris. Instead, the records from Bury St Edmunds, Ghent, Montpellier and Ragusa show a more representative picture of medieval urban life because they weren't exceptional. These were functional, mid-sized and economically active places where the mechanisms of the era operated without the distorting wealth of a capital city. The small town is where most medieval people actually lived, and it's where the historical pattern is clearest. The danger in any reconstruction work is the temptation to romanticize what we're looking at. These towns were functional and often genuinely beautiful in their density, but they were also harsh environments. In these streets, 30 to 40% of children died before their 5th birthday, and a failed harvest meant starvation arrived within months. Your legal standing and your access to food depended entirely on the circumstances of your birth. The reconstruction doesn't clean that up because the court rolls and plague chronicles simply won't let it. Many of the structural problems these towns faced are still with us in the modern world. We still deal with housing density, waste management, fire risk, and the legal complexity of overlapping jurisdictions. The forms of our cities changed, but the fundamental problems didn't. The traveller standing at the gate always smelled the city before they saw it. That remains the most honest summary of what a medieval town really was, a dense, working machine built by thousands of small decisions. It was a walled space where people tried to survive and occasionally thrive, despite never having enough of anything. It was loud, it smelled, it frequently burned down, and yet it worked. If there's a specific city or period you want to see reconstructed next, let me know in the comments. I'd love to keep building this journey into the past with you, so thank you for watching.